Thank you for joining us for this briefing on the war between the United States, Israel and Iran, and how this impacts South Africa. We will be looking at how the present global landscape will impact on South Africa over the next quarter. At present, we are confronted with events that is reshaping the strategic environment in which South Africa must operate. The rapidly escalating confrontation involving the United States, Israel, and Iran has outgrown its regional frame. It now acts as a global pressure amplifier that reverberates through energy markets, financial systems, diplomatic alignments, and the wider information space. South Africa stands directly in the path of this turbulence, not as a bystander, but as a deeply interconnected economy and a state whose foreign policy choices are under a sharper international lens than at any point in the recent past. It is important to frame the context within which this briefing takes place. At Threat in Sight, we have extensively modeled the war, its options and possible outcomes. What is important to note, and which formed the basis of this briefing, are the following key points. Firstly, the diplomatic window is narrowing, and it is anticipated that diplomacy will enter the point of no return within 60 to 90 days. We identified three possible outcomes. The first is a negotiated ceasefire. As the best case option, we assign only a 20% probability to this. On the other extreme, we anticipate a worsening option as the worst case, with further regional escalation and a full-scale war. To this, we assign a 25% probability. Between these two extremes is the most likely scenario, rated with a 55% probability. It comprises a prolonged attrition period with a slow degradation of infrastructure, will have no clear victor, and will further polarize the region. The best case scenario is anticipated to last 6 months, the most likely scenario 24 months, and a worst case scenario 5 years. Considered further United States deployments into the region, we assess the probability of a ceasefire within the next 30 days to be around 8%, increasing to 25% by the end of August 2026. It is anticipated that international mediators will enter the conflict within the next 4 weeks to negotiate a temporary cessation of hostilities and the free flow of oil throughout the region. As for the Brent crude oil price, we anticipate it to peak by the end of May 2026 at $118 per barrel, return to around $108 per barrel by the end of August 2026, and settle at $100 per barrel by year end. From a global GDP perspective, we see a decline of 1.8% and an overall global inflationary effect, adding 0.9% to the pre-war inflation forecasts. From a terrorism threat perspective, South Africa is moving from a low-risk environment into a low-medium risk threat level. Over the next 14 days, it is expected that the United States will prepare for further escalation, lobbying for an expanded strike mandate, while Israel will expand its naval blockade of weapons shipment to Yemen and Lebanon. At the same time, Iran will demonstrate its ability and readiness to oppose its coastline against an amphibious invasion. Although much speculation around munitions has been circulating on the internet, our assessment is that the United States, Israel and Iran, at its current depletion and manufacturing rate, has sufficient munitions for a sustained war. Strategically, Iran is focusing their tactical response primarily around deception and proxy deployment, with a high focus on attrition, trying to deplete the United States, Israel and other Middle East countries' ability to defend and launch counterattacks. It is anticipated that they will expand on their use of cyber and information warfare in the next few days. Israel, on the other hand, is following a blitzkrieg strategy, with most of its focus being directed at delivering responses at speed with some cyber information and deception tactics in the mix. The United States is primarily focused on the cyber and information side, followed by an economic and attrition strategy. We assess the effectiveness of Iran's strategy over the past 2 weeks, averaging at around 83%. Israel is also averaging around 83%, while the United States' effectiveness range between 22% to 92%, averaging at around 57%. Its initial Anaconda plan proved to be a failure for the most part. It then followed with a shock and awe, rapid dominance strategy, which was also not successful. At present, it has migrated towards a network-centric warfare aimed at cyber and information warfare, followed by speed of execution and coalition participation, and is proving to be more successful, ranging between 80 and 90%, which places it in the same effectiveness level as Israel and Iran. It must be noted that the United States' shock and awe strategy also did not work during the 2003 Iraq War, and its Anaconda plan also showed little effectiveness in the past. From an energy disruption perspective, a total closure to Hormuz will cut global oil supply by 30% or 21 million barrels per day. If the Red Sea flow is disrupted by Houthi activities, this could disrupt an additional 5 million barrels per day, resulting in a total disruption of roughly 37%. Trump's assurances that Venezuela could plug much of this disruption is far removed from reality. At its peak during the 60s and 70s, Venezuela was able to produce less than 4 million barrels, while its output is less than 1 million barrels per day. Rerouting oil past the Cape of Good Hope will add a 10 to 14 day timeline for deliveries. We anticipate that the combined effect of production loss, increased shipping time, and costs and insurance will see a 9% increase in Brent crude oil per barrel, will increase the diesel price by 14%, aviation Jeddah 1 by 16%, and natural gas by 16% in the next 30 days. With this context, we can see that the Middle East, has entered its most intense period of escalation in more than a decade. Since early 2024, Iran has taken unprecedented steps, including its first direct mass strike on Israel during Operation True Promise, a coordinated wave of drones and missiles launched in retaliation for the Damascus consulate strike. Israel's response was calibrated to avoid a full-scale war, yet demonstrated deep reach into Iranian territory. The following year saw a brief but intense 12-day confrontation cantered on Iran's nuclear infrastructure supported by the United States. What followed were renewed joint strikes by the United States and Israel within Iranian territory, and a sustained pattern of retaliatory action across the region by Iran and aligned networks. The cycle of strike and response has now pushed this confrontation into its most complex phase. This is not just another chapter in a long-running rivalry. It is a structural and strategic shift with global repercussions. This is not what the United States or Israel expected, and Iran is setting the scene, contradicting statements by the United States and Israel in terms of who actually launched the first attack on Iran on 28 February 2026, and President Trump placing the reason for his decision squarely on the shoulders of Pete Hegseth, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and Marco Rubio, stating that they informed him that an attack from Iran was imminent, supports the idea that as the war is prolonged, the United States is realizing that the military and political strategy from Iran's side has shifted from posturing and tit-for-tat exchanges to a more long-term and sustained tactical response. It is the type of miscalculation we cautioned about in previous updates. For South Africa, these global events are becoming local in very practical ways. We import much of our crude oil, and we are priced at the margin of global energy markets. When supply-related issues cause the fuel costs to move, inflation moves with it. The effect is felt within retail, transportation, manufacturing, and essential services. Our currency is particularly sensitive to global risk sentiment. Each flare-up in the conflict triggers renewed caution from investors who may seek to trim emerging market exposure. Treasury feels the pressure in widening financing needs. Eskom faces heavier diesel burdens when emergency generation is required, which simply makes sustained use unaffordable and has the potential to see the return of load shedding. The economic dimension is only one side of this moment. The diplomatic terrain is equally demanding. Our position on the Gaza conflict and our legal action at the International Court of Justice elevated South Africa's voice across the global South, but also sharpened political hostility in key parts of Washington. The Lady R controversy caused skepticism about South Africa's non-alignment credibility. At the same time, our deepening role within BRICS and its expansion, which brings us into closer association with Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Indonesia, has strengthened ties to China and Russia, while intensifying perceptions in the United States that Pretoria is moving into an adversarial orbit. Domestic American politics compound this. In Washington, the tone has shifted materially, and Congress have advanced legislation that calls for a reassessment of the entire relationship with South Africa, from trade privileges to sanctions on officials and tighter oversight of our diplomatic conduct. Tariffs imposed on South African goods have already forced South Africa to expand its exports beyond the United States, further embedding South Africa in BRICS. While our benefits under AGOA remains in place, our eligibility is under heavier scrutiny than before. If this trajectory continues, targeted sanctions on South African officials or state-linked entities become a plausible next step. Such escalation would trigger a serious diplomatic rupture, eroding trust between Pretoria and Washington. Visa restrictions and asset freezes would complicate government operations. The markets will respond with heightened volatility, and repercussions at home would be significant. The government of national unity, already navigating ideological differences, would come under sharper internal strain. Movements and parties with anti-Western positions would find new momentum, while others with pro-United States alignments would harden their stance. The result is an intensified polarization that erodes social cohesion and raises the risk of more fractious and violent public protests. This political dynamic will filter into the street, into labor relations, into municipal service delivery pressures, and into the way communities respond to economic stress. The likelihood of service delivery protests and wider unrest grows when fuel costs rise and food inflation accelerates, particularly in an environment where unemployment remains high and local government capacity is uneven. If load shedding returns because emergency generation becomes financially unsustainable, the social disorganization risk increases further. On the strategic front, South Africa faces a demanding balancing act. BRICS offers alternatives that are valuable at a time when the global system is fragmenting. There is diplomatic cover, a measure of economic diversification, new channels for development finance through the New Development Bank and space to pilot payment systems that reduce exposure to unilateral sanctions. Those advantages must be weighed against the reality that Washington interprets the same mechanisms as part of a shift into an adversarial posture. The more visibly we lean into BRICS, the more aggressively some American actors may push for punitive measures. Our task is to balance the benefits of diversification with strict adherence to sanctions compliance, and to avoid even the perception that South Africa could be a conduit for sanction evasion. There is also a financial reality that we cannot ignore. Our banking system is sophisticated and deeply connected to global dollar clearing networks. Even a perceived increase in compliance risk could trigger de-risking by international counterparties, add friction to cross-border payments, and raise the cost of doing business for our exporters and importers. The probability of extreme restrictions is not high at present, but it rises in step with geopolitical deterioration. We must manage that probability proactively and with care by tightening and evidencing compliance frameworks in a way that reassures partners and rating agencies alike. The confrontation extends beyond the kinetic domain. As the conflict intensifies, our cyber risk rises. State-aligned and opportunistic hacker groups often target distant countries during periods of geopolitical tension. Our energy infrastructure, ports, government, corporate systems, and our media platforms are attractive targets. Strengthening cyber resilience is now a core national security priority. This includes tighter controls at state-owned entities and within the payments ecosystem, clear incident response playbooks, and a coordinated posture that extends across critical suppliers and provincial authorities. Environmentally, an increased reliance on diesel during periods of grid stress has emissions implications. When global shipping is rerouted away from higher risk corridors, more large vessels pivot around the Cape, affecting coastal air quality and adding to ecological pressures in our maritime zones. Fertilizer price spikes linked to Middle East disruptions can feed directly into food inflation, and that pressure is felt most sharply by low-income households and by municipalities already struggling to balance service delivery obligations with volatile input costs. Water security challenges do not pause while geopolitics unfolds. Rising costs make it more expensive to maintain and enhance critical infrastructure at precisely the moment when the system is under the greatest stress. Amid all this, there is a point worth making with clarity. South Africa does not face a military threat from the United States. Washington has no strategic rationale for kinetic force in this context. The arena of confrontation is far more likely to be economic, diplomatic, financial, technological, and informational at this stage. That is where the United States will apply its pressure. And it is in these domains that we must be prepared, resilient, and agile. Considering the near-term path, in the energy sphere, we need to expand our strategic fuel reserves while diversifying sources and supply routes to reduce concentration risk and lowers the probability of a single choke point. Accelerate renewable energy rollout as a geopolitical hedge for times such as these. In finance and trade, we should actively separate trade negotiations from geopolitical disputes. Decoupling economic interests from contentious legal or diplomatic issues is not about abandoning principles. It is about preventing collateral damage to workers, exporters, and communities who bear the brunt when trade doors swing shut. Securing continued access to preferential trade arrangements requires deliberate, consistent engagement and a posture that makes it harder for partners to justify punitive action. We must also ready ourselves for tougher compliance expectations, which means robust sanctions screening, transparent processes for high-risk counterparties, and visible collaboration between regulators, the banking sector, and law enforcement. The objective is to preserve confidence in our financial system so that de-risking pressures do not cut off the flow of legitimate trade and investment. On logistics and industrial activity, the costs associated with rerouting global shipping and rising insurance premia are already eroding margins. Exporters in agriculture and automotive manufacturing are feeling the impact most acutely, and smaller firms are often least able to absorb the shock. Port performance and rail reliability will be the decisive domestic variables. Every hour saved at a terminal and every ton moved efficiently on rail translates directly into competitiveness. If emergency generation at Eskom becomes more expensive and less sustainable, we face the risk of renewed load shedding. That would compress growth prospects, threaten job creation, and could edge the economy toward recession. It is imperative that we continue to prioritize the operational recovery of the grid, the connection of private generation capacity, and the clearing of backlogs in transmission investment. The political context at home is highly relevant to how these economic pressures are absorbed. The government of national unity must navigate ideological differences while keeping a clear eye on the living realities of citizens. The time for populism has passed, and we need pragmatic solutions and not ideology. Higher fuel and food prices hit the poor first and hardest. When the information space becomes more polarized and misinformation campaigns gain traction, social cohesion weakens. Civil society and organized labor will become more vocal, and their pressure will shape policy responses. It is essential that government communicate with clarity, that decisions are disciplined, and that we avoid contradictory signals that confuse markets and partners. There is a specific scenario that deserves attention. If sanctions were to be applied to senior party or government figures, the diplomatic fallout would be severe. Engagement would be downgraded and reputational damage would follow. Economically, the rand would weaken, borrowing costs would rise, and foreign investment would hesitate. Financial institutions abroad would examine South African transactions with greater scrutiny. Politically, factions on both extremes would be emboldened. Those with an anti-Western sentiment would claim vindication, while those seeking a closer alignment with the United States would argue for a policy reversal. The net effect would be a sharper polarization that complicates governance and raises the temperature in the street. It would also push some within the political space to lean more heavily on BRICS as a counterweight, which could in turn harden the stance of American policymakers. This is a spiral we must avoid, and when we say we, it is not only a reference to government, but includes the opposition, parties, private institutions, and the population in its entirety. Within our society, advocacy groups will continue to shape the conversation. Some have argued for targeted sanctions on corrupt leaders, suggesting these could be insulated from broader economic harm. The reality is that in an interconnected system, the damage cannot be neatly contained. Financial markets respond to signals, not caveats. A push for sanctions, even if framed as narrow, will have wider consequences across confidence, capital flows, and country risk. As that conversation unfolds, pressure on the governing party from both radical and nationalist corners would likely grow, with racial and ideological fault lines becoming more visible. The political map could be redrawn in ways that weaken the centre and empower more extreme positions. There are also opportunities embedded in this turbulence that we should not miss. A weaker rand can boost the competitiveness of export-oriented sectors, most notably in mining. If we can stabilize energy supply, unclog logistics, and maintain regulatory certainty, mining houses can increase output and capture share as investors diversify portfolios in a risk-on environment shaped by global conflict. The same logic applies to non-mining exporters who can lean into demand in markets where our products remain tariff competitive. To do so, they will need predictable power, efficient ports, reliable rail, and clear policy signals on critical inputs. Our payments and cyber posture must evolve in lockstep with these external risks. The more the United States, Israel and Iran confrontation spills into cyberspace, the more we should expect probing attacks against our systems. Whether to make a political point, to steal intellectual property, or simply to create noise and confusion. A coordinated national approach to cyber resilience is essential. This includes uplifted security controls, threat intelligence sharing, incident simulation, and tested recovery plans across energy, transport, finance, and government platforms. It also includes hardening the payments ecosystem so that cross-border flows can be maintained even under stress. Shipping security remains a critical watch point. A sustained disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would worsen the supply picture. In a complete closure scenario, the South African strategic fuel reserves could be drawn down within roughly 3 weeks, after which rationing would become a possibility with significant knock-on effects for mobility, logistics, and growth. This is why diversification of routes and suppliers is not optional, but a strategic imperative which must be addressed with the utmost urgency. In closing, South Africa stands at a crossroads where global conflict, domestic fragility, and rapid geopolitical realignment intersect. The energy shock risk is real. The financial spillovers are visible in the rand and in risk premia. The diplomatic pressure is intensifying. The information space is polarized and vulnerable to manipulation. The social fabric is under strain. None of this means we are powerless. It means our choices carry greater weight, and our execution must be more disciplined. To navigate this complex environment, we must maintain a disciplined foreign policy posture that is principled, pragmatic, and clearly communicated. We must seek de-escalation where we can and separate trade engagement from political or moral disputes that create political heat. Secondly, we must focus on strengthening sanction compliance frameworks across the public and private sectors to demonstrate the strength to partners through transparency and collaboration. Thirdly, accelerate energy resilience through reserve expansion, supplier and route diversification, renewable build-out, and a relentless focus on grid performance. Fourthly, we must protect the financial system's connective tissue by hardening cyber defenses and payment rails, and by engaging proactively with global banks and regulators to prevent de-risking spiral effects. Next, we must lift our logistics backbone through port and rail reform and operational excellence so that exporters can hold ground even as costs rise. And finally, we must manage the domestic political temperature through clear, honest communication about trade-offs and timelines, and through targeted support that cushions the most vulnerable from energy and food inflation. If we execute on these priorities with precision, we can navigate the short to medium term without sacrificing long-term strategic positioning. We can preserve key trade benefits, reassure partners about our financial integrity, and continue to diversify our economic relationships in a way that strengthens resilience rather than signaling alignment with any adversarial bloc. We can also turn some of the volatility to our advantage by enabling sectors that benefit from a weaker currency and political turmoil within a war economic period to expand output and employment while we build the foundations of a more reliable, less import-dependent energy system. The message is straightforward, the stakes are high, but the mitigation path is manageable if we act with clarity and unity of purpose. Our future will be shaped not only by events in the Gulf or decisions in Washington, but by the choices we make in Pretoria and the coherence with which we implement them. This is the time for steady leadership, for pragmatic diplomacy, for institutional resilience, and for a firm grip on execution. If we do that, South Africa can weather this storm and emerge more agile, more credible, and better prepared for the world that is taking shape around us. We thank you for your time. If you found the content helpful, please like our channel, subscribe, and ring the bell icon to ensure that you remain up to date. For further assistance, please reach out to us.